format of the event. We've got two of my A-level students, two students from the school where I teach A-levels, Anisha and Khadija here, who very kindly volunteered to step up to interview Gus. We thought it would be a nice format for the event to have a kind of intergenerational dialogue in terms of the struggle for racism and how it's developed and evolved over the decades and compares to experiences and challenges today. Anisha, I first met when she started doing my politics A-level course beginning of last year, and very quickly realized that Michael Gove's vision of what the politics should be about didn't really match hers. It's a disappointment I'm just very familiar with, but it's always a bit of a shock to new students who enroll on the course. So she didn't last very long on that, but after a assembly by a wonderful teacher, Alex Brown, who trained at our school and now teaches in London, came back to do an assembly on decolonizing the curriculum. She's a fantastic decolonial scholar in the field of theology in her own right, and she came back to do an assembly on decolonizing the curriculum, and it sparked a conversation right there immediately after the assembly with Anisha and some of the other students, and out of that conversation was born the OSA kind of anti-racist group that Anisha's taken a leading role in, a much needed student-led initiative. And Khadija has also been involved in a student-led initiative group called Controversial Conversations, an after-school political discussion group. The two of them have been really kind of leading forces in that group, which has been really powerful, quite moving often discussion group around issues facing young people and wider society. So yeah, two amazing students, so I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation today. I'm now going to just hand over to Nigel to introduce Gus and to kick off the event. Thank you.
Great, thanks Dan. So we're extremely honoured, very, very honoured this evening to welcome Professor Gus John as our very special guest to Blackbird Leys and Oxford. And this gathering is very excited by this wonderful opportunity for us to listen to Professor Gus highlight some key themes in his over 6 decades experience of struggle in the Caribbean, Africa, and the UK for racial equality and social justice, as well as this fantastic chance to engage in discussion with Professor Gus and our excellent interviewers, Anisha and Khadija. Just a very brief bio as a way of introduction for Professor Gus John, and I think what I'll do is I'll skip the 1960s because I'm sure Gus is going to cover, alongside Anisha and Khadija, he'll cover his early years in Oxford. So I'll fast forward to the 1980s in terms of Gus John's trailblazing work. So in 1981, Professor Gus John was one of the organisers of the Black People's Day of Action, and in the 1980s and 1990s, alongside John LaRose, Jessica Huntley, and Eric Huntley, helped to organise international book fairs of radical Black and Third World books. In 1989, Professor Gus became the first Black Director of Education in Britain. And Gus's continued activism and expansive areas of work and multiple interests covers advising member states in the African Union and the Caribbean on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals related to youth and education. A key aspect of Professor Gus John's work today focuses on challenging the school exclusions and criminalisation of Black youth. Professor Gus John will speak for an hour on some of his work spanning 6 decades in conversation with Anisha and Khadija, followed by Q&A. So please let us, with a big round of applause, please welcome Professor Gus John and alongside Khadija and Anisha.
How are we doing this? Thank you.
Am I to say some stuff and then the Q&A, or are you going to do?
I think they're just going to
We're happy to
jump into asking you.
Yeah,
start
yeah, yeah.
asking. Well, I don't think so. That's fine. Okay. So you guys, what are we going to start with? That one first. Okay. So we want to start by asking you, how did you challenge school exclusions and the criminalisation of black youth?
Okay. Do you need this to record what you're doing?
It's not for me, it's for people at the
So
back.
they can hear.
Well, the people at the back would be able to hear me because I tend to boom. I hate
I'll let
I
you know.
hate these things.
It's not for me, yeah.
I don't get on very well with them. If you can't hear me at the back, just shout, please. I prefer not to use microphones.
When he's speaking, just put it by his mouth. So then just TV.
Okay, so school exclusions. My first encounter with all of that was in the late 1960s. I was working in Birmingham for the Renemy Trust on a youth project. They were basically concerned about what was happening to young black people in Birmingham in terms of policing, schools, and so on. Handsworth in Birmingham. And I became very aware that lots of young black people were suffering disadvantage and oppression on the axis of race, youth, and generally speaking, their struggle to build an identity as young black people in 1960s Birmingham. The school exclusion issue arises, or at that stage, used to arise in this way. And it was a continuation of what I experienced and struggled with here in Oxford. Because when black parents came here to work in what used to be the Oxford and Morris car factory down the way, the parents came first, typically, particularly the fathers, and the children joined them afterwards. And the children experienced a tremendous amount of racism from white kids in the schools. The teachers didn't quite understand the children. And those who came from Jamaica had a particularly nasty time because of the way they spoke. So while the schools respected the home language of, for example, the Punjabi children who then lived in Jericho, just beyond St. Giles, they had no respect whatsoever for the languages spoken by Caribbean children. And the only description and understanding they had of that was of children speaking broken English. So they were laying a deficit on those children to begin with, and basically saying to them that the only language you know and the language in which you communicate and in which you understand and interpret the world, we are invalidating. Now, I mean, that's a big deal. And so quite often, issues would arise. White children would harass black kids. They would respond. The teachers would not see what triggered the response, and then would seek to punish them. There was a lot of that going on then, it still goes on now, all these years later. And to a large extent, many of those exclusions were to do with behavior. Head teachers thought that the conduct of those children was unacceptable, and they were excluded. And that pattern persisted in the schooling system for a long time. I mean, and in addition to the exclusion from school, for those reasons to do with behavior and discipline, was exclusion and segregation into supplementary school, not supplementary, ESN schools, schools for the educationally subnormal, because at the time those schools were using tests of intelligence to assess children's ability, which were biased fundamentally on the axis of race and of class. And as most of you would know, come 1971, Bernard Cord wrote a study and called his little book, How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System. Now, we have to understand the link between that and school exclusions. Because there were many children being sent to these schools for the educationally subnormal who weren't in any way, shape, or form subnormal. And that was very badly defined at the time. So children used to be called dunce, they used to be called backward, they used to be called mentally retarded, and all the rest of it. And it was therefore very important for parents to understand how schools worked, what powers they had to resist those assessments that were giving rise to these decisions to send children to ESN schools. And in many ways, because teachers did not really listen to children, those children felt totally frustrated, and the schools were more concerned about punishing them than supporting the development of awareness and understanding of the schooling system and how they could use schooling and the opportunities it presented to improve themselves. Roll on some decades and one finds that the level of exclusions amongst black children is totally disproportionate. When the Labour government got into power in 1997, having been in the Thatcher wilderness for almost 19 years, the level of exclusions amongst black children was 6-1. In other words, 6 black children would be excluded for every 1 white child who was excluded. And that was hugely discriminatory. So when I ceased being a chief education officer, director of education, in the London borough of Hackney in 1997, I teamed up with a man called Jerry German, who was the principal education officer at the Commission for Racial Equality. And we started looking at this whole exclusions business. By the beginning of 1999, we determined that we needed to form an organization that could actually support excluded children and their parents. So we formed an organization called the Communities Empowerment Network. And our main business really was dealing with school exclusions, supporting children who were excluded and their parents. And every year, practically, we dealt with about 1,000 school exclusions, permanent exclusions of black children, 80% of whom were black boys. Totally scandalous. Waste of opportunity, waste of life, the damaging of children's life chances. And that is still going on now. The ratios are a bit less, but generally speaking, many young people, a whole generation, has been lost, certainly to the economy and to society, because some of them, too many of them, have ended up in jail as a result of permanent exclusion. And now, as you know, the government has introduced these pupil referral units, which are basically containment centers for young people. They're supposed to assist them in getting over whatever behavioral problems they may have, but very few of them actually get reintegrated into the mainstream schools. And the scandal of it all is this: these multiple academy trusts that run academies, the one down the way there, Oxford Spires, is run by a MAT, a multiple academy trust called Anthem. There are others, run by all sorts of funny people, including carpet magnates and car dealers and those people who have got such wonderful education qualifications. Once the academization issue was introduced, those schools have been excluding even more students than before. The government has encouraged them to operate very inflexible, zero tolerance policies. And so some of them hand out behavior points like confetti. And for the most minor infractions, children are given behavior points, and when you tot up the number of points, it leads either to internal exclusion for X number of days or external fixed term exclusion. And if you have more than 45 days of fixed term exclusions, not sequentially necessarily, that entitles the school to exclude you permanently. And there's a lot of injustices going on in relation to all of that. So I'm giving this long answer to say that the exclusion process has been an anchor, if you like, the foundation for what I call, what my colleague in London, Tottenham, Stafford Scott calls the war on youth. And that war on black youth has been going on since I did this research for the Runnymede Trust in Birmingham in 1969.
Do you think that we're any closer to necessarily having progress when it comes to, I guess, awareness surrounding the high exclusions of black youth? And if not, whose responsibility would you say it is to, first of all, educate teachers and then make actual change within the system itself? Because if you're doing it teacher by teacher, it's not going to make
like wide systemic change, but if it was to make wide systemic change, who do you think that falls under? Like, who's meant to change that system?
Okay.
Last question, Khadija.
At lunchtime, when I first met these two, and I learned that they were going to be interrogating me, I asked them to be kind. Because I knew they were going to be pretty fierce. Let me come about this in a roundabout sort of way. When I worked in this, when I studied in this city in the middle 1960s, we formed, we didn't call it that then, but later on they became known as Black Supplementary Schools. So I used to leave Blackfriars, jump on my bicycle, come down and ride around these streets, giving support to parents who were having endless problems with head teachers and their children. Two things were necessary. And I found at the time when I wasn't singing Gregorian chant to do both. One of them was to get teachers, and they were predominantly white teachers at the time, to have a much more developed understanding of black children, their needs, the high aspirations that their parents had for them, even though some of their parents themselves were only semi-literate. So that they could abandon these stereotypes they had about black children being incapable of learning or whatever it may be. But then the second thing we found it necessary to do was to connect those children not only with their own history, the history of black people in the Caribbean diaspora and on the continent of Africa itself, but to give them some understanding that although in their schools they saw nothing written by black people, there were no images on the walls which gave them some positive reference about themselves. We need to illustrate to them that, yes, black people have been writing books for generations. Black people have been writing about our own history for generations, our own spirituality, and so on. So, one way of building those children's self-esteem and enabling them to have positive attitudes towards themselves was, in a sense, to ignore what the schools were doing until we were ready to challenge it, and give those children the props, the material with which they could identify as black children. And that is why John LaRose in 1966 started New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park, of which I'm now a director. And 2 years later, Eric and Jessica Huntley started Bogle Louverture Publications, doing pretty much the same sort of thing. So we started to build a black education movement. And we took responsibility for how our children were being schooled. And while we dealt with that within our communities through the growth of the supplementary school movement, we were also challenging what the teachers were doing in schools to those children. So it was a two-pronged approach. In the early 1970s, I and others started the Black Parents Movement in North London. And in 1975, at Conway Hall in Red Lion Square near Holborn, we had a summit. And we discussed the relationship between schooling, work, how certain people, how the system had been organized, the education and schooling system, organized in a manner to basically replicate elitism. The philosophy, the theory was this: if you're going to go down the mines, if you're going to be working as laborers in these satanic mills in Yorkshire or whatever it is, then you don't need a whole heap of intellectual power to be able to do that. People were interested in your ability to graft and the whole sort of brain and brawn type dichotomy that people talked about. So consequently, there wasn't an expectation. I'm talking about white people now and white working class communities. There wasn't an expectation that white working class communities should be or was entitled to the same kind of quality education that other people got. And what we found when we came here as black people from different parts of the colonized world was people, in a sense, getting angry, intolerant of our demands because they just felt that we, who they considered to be people who, if we didn't live in trees, we walked behind cows, and that was basically all we knew. The attitude towards black people as migrants, our abilities, what we did in the places we came from, was frankly pretty vile. So we determined that we needed to understand the schooling system, how it was organized, where it came from, in order to understand how it sees us and would treat us. So we had a conference, another conference at the Keskidi Center near King's Cross, run by a wonderful man from Guyana called Oscar Abrams. It was a community arts center. That's where Linton Kwesi Johnson began to do his work. And people like T-Bone Wilson and Rufus Collins and those actors, they all cut their teeth in that place. And at that major conference, we articulated certain principles. And that gets me to the heart of your question. Independent parents' power and independent students' power is the key to change in education and schooling. So what were we saying? We were saying that teachers are unionized and organized to the hilt. National Union of Teachers, as it was then, National Association of Health Teachers, the National Association of Schoolmasters and of Women Teachers, all these unions. And then for those who were not teaching staff, there were people like the GMB, General and Municipal, or NALCO, or whatever. So all the adults in the schooling system were unionized, and they had their rights as workers protected. There was no such union amongst parents, and there was no kind of organization amongst students. And when they tried to organize in schools, head teachers took a rather dim view of that. So we determined we needed to start a black youth movement and a black parents movement. The black youth movement was formed by a core group of people, including John LaRose's two sons, and people who had been to the George Patmore Supplementary School, which he started, and the Albertina Supplementary School, Albertina Sylvester, round the corner from John LaRose's house and from New Beacon Books. And those houses were constantly full of young people doing supplementary school work, getting guidance on how to handle situations in schools and so on and so forth. In other words, we found it necessary to organize ourselves and help to organize our children so that we could resist the racism that there was within schooling. Mark Twain famously said, I can't remember what year, I never let my schooling interfere with my education. We had to make sure that British schooling did not interfere with the education of our children. We had to educate them. African studies, black studies, understanding of Europe, understanding of colonialism, understanding of imperialism, understanding of how we came to be a Caribbean diaspora of African people in the Caribbean. And to this day, most schools don't even teach that kind of stuff. Most schools do not teach black students or white students key elements, key events in our settlement in this country since, let's say, 1945, the end of the Second World War. We, as a core and fundamental part of post-war British social history, are simply written out of that history. Which is why more and more of us, including myself, have embraced the responsibility to write that stuff so that current and future generations could understand that we didn't simply come here and moan and complain about what racism was doing to us or what the system was doing to us. We did stuff ourselves. We built our institutions, these bookshops I'm talking about, and publishing houses, black theater companies, black film collectives, West Indian World that was, Caribbean Times, The Voice that now is, except that it's a very weak voice and it doesn't know where the hell it's going. Right. So we built our own institutions. And we had to lay a foundation in order that our children could not only survive in the schooling system, but flourish. And one of the things I certainly, and indeed many of my colleagues, as part of that movement, have had to emphasize is that education is not just for personal advancement and aggrandizement. It's not just a question of being a high flyer, getting into Oxford and Cambridge or St. Andrews or UCL or Bristol or these Russell Group universities, and then pursuing a path towards riches and OBs and CBs and all those other kind of wretched BEs. It has to be about more than that. Because no black person in this society could consider themselves liberated and free of prejudice and discrimination and lack of opportunity, etc., until we all are. And it's the same thing that they say to black parents. There is a tendency amongst us to dump on one another. The state talks all the time about absent fathers and a pathologizing of the black family. But many of us do that ourselves. So our children slaughter one another on the streets using knives, using guns or whatever. And there are some amongst us who determine that, well, two things. One is because we have not made sure that those children know God. And if they were dragged to the Church of God of Prophecy or New Testament or Seventh-day Adventists or whatever, then they won't be inclined to be so diabolic. That's one argument. And the second argument is that if we get our children to concentrate on being the best, not be identifying with this other lot, then they would be okay. And I had cause to have a painful conversation with two parents who were grieving. They were parents of my son's best friend, high flyer, en route to getting a first-class degree from one of these Russell Group universities. His family lived in Old Trafford in Manchester. So he comes from university. It's a reading week, and he's in his study, head down, doing his reading, getting his revision done. And he decides to go and get some fresh air, go and get some food. So he leaves his desk in his mother's house, walks a short distance down the road to a takeaway, orders his takeaway, and while he's waiting for it, a shot rings out. He's hit in the head and drops dead. Some young lunatics in a car drives by, think they saw somebody from another gang in that place, and just shoots indiscriminately. One person had the arm shattered. He got a bullet to his head and died. But his parents were those who used to say, all them dirty little boy them. The parents this, the parents that, they have no ambition, they have whatever it is. Okay, so that may be so. But as I said to them, I said, once they finished grieving and said they don't know why, etc., I said to them, you remember, you used to come to these meetings when I would be saying that we cannot consider that, irrespective of how good we think they are, how much they're applying themselves or whatever, we cannot rest assured and be confident that our children are safe unless we work together to make sure that all children are safe. And that those boys running around in cars with guns and knives and so on have no need to do that and could be assisted to turn their lives around. Because those parents had no expectation whatsoever that the son would meet such a useless, violent death at the hands of people like himself. So, independent organization of parents and of students. We don't get enough of that. There are situations where, in spite of what's going on in a school 60% black kids, 10% black teachers, 0% black senior managers. And the white senior managers are afraid of their own shadow when it comes to race. They don't want to talk about it. They don't know how to handle it. And the only way they can deal with issues that arise around students, particularly around race, whether it be name calling or whatever it is to apply punitive sanctions. So you call somebody a nigger or you call them a packy, and they get 4 days suspension. You don't deal with the whole issue of that oppressive language, where it comes from, how it becomes part of the whole racist culture of Britain. (1986), Manchester, Burnage High School. A school with a growing percentage of South Asian students, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, and so on. About a third South Asian, third Caribbean, third white. And this white, right-wing little boy, 14 years old, decides to target year 7, 11-year-old Bangladeshi students. A Bangladeshi student in his class, Ahmed Iqbal Ullah, who was tall and strong, also age 14, challenges him and says, no, you're not going to wrap these kids around the head and call them names and treat them like this. So this white boy challenges him to a fight. And Ahmed sent him away with his tail between his legs. So he leaves the school, this white boy, and says to his friends as he's going out of school, if this packy picks upon me again, I'll kill him. Next morning, he's leaving school. He packs a long kitchen knife and goes to school. School hasn't started yet. Ahmed is in the playground. He goes up to him and starts talking about the fight the night before. And before you know it, he takes the knife and plunges it into this boy's stomach. He's bleeding internally. The teachers run around as headless chickens, not quite knowing what to do. An ambulance takes God knows how long to come. He's taken to the nearest A&E unit. The stabbing happened at about 9:15. By 11 o'clock, he was dead. Manchester City Council decided to have an inquiry. The Bangladeshi community demanded that there should be an inquiry as to how this thing could have happened. Ian MacDonald QC, now deceased, asked me to be one of the commissioners, and there was one Bangladeshi woman and one Pakistani woman, 4 of us. And we had to sit a commission of inquiry into this murder. What was going on in the school before then? How were issues of race being dealt with amongst the students? What competence the staff had to deal with those sorts of issues? And what have you? And I have to confess, that inquiry, which lasted weeks, was perhaps the most traumatizing experience I have had in my entire professional career. It was awful. Some of us as commissioners went home in the night, and we had to find all sorts of ways to cleanse ourselves out before we could actually get to sleep. We eventually wrote our report. And we're going to publish it. Manchester City Council, who commissioned the report, the inquiry, determined that we could not publish the report as written because they were likely to be sued because of the things we said in it. So they wanted to suppress the report and not publish it. And we determined we would publish and be damned. Let the head teacher sue us. Let the chief education officer sue us. We couldn't give a toss. And we published the report in the form of a book, Murder in the Playground. 1989, the book was published. Okay. We called upon the Secretary of State for Education, Kenneth Baker, to read the report and understand what we were saying about racism in education and racial violence in schools. And although we provided him, before we published the thing, we provided him with the report. Because the government was about to enact what was going to be the most radical oversight review of education since the 1944 Education Act. And some of you will remember that came out as the Education Reform Act of 1988. So we thought to ourselves, this thing is happening now. 86 was the murder. We spent God knows how many months inquiring, and we spent months very carefully writing this report. We determined that it was important that the government took heed of what we found, discuss it in Parliament, and make sure that the intelligence, the insights that arose from that found its way into the Education Reform Act of 1988. Effectively, Kenneth Baker and that useless lot stuck their fingers up at us. He refused not only to meet with Ian MacDonald as chair of the Commission of Inquiry, he refused to put the report in the library in the House of Commons so that MPs could access it and learn from all of that. That is, okay, that was not just the stupidity of one Secretary of State for Education. It was systemic. The government itself was at that time passing the most brutal and draconian legislation, race relations legislation, creating an atmosphere of fear amongst black people, giving oxygen to the National Front, the British National Party, Column 88, and those neo-fascists who were indulging liberally in internal terrorism within the state. And we called it that. We as activists called it internal terrorism. Indian, Pakistani communities, anybody who looked as if they might come from South Asia, were having excrement put through their letterboxes, fire bombs put through the letterboxes. People were getting incinerated in their own homes by these neo-fascists. And we called on the government to outlaw those organizations. They did absolutely nothing. So when we come later to consider the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the murder of Roland Adams and all of those other people, as well as the manslaughter that was taking place routinely at the hands of the police. People talk about deaths in custody. That's a nonsense. If you call hundreds of people who die while in the custody of the police deaths in custody, you're effectively saying that black people have an unnatural propensity to die when they were in the presence of the police. And that's patently stupid. So what we have is police killings. Police killings which ought to be considered either murder or manslaughter. And yet all of these coroner's courts come back with verdicts of accidental or open verdict or misadventure or whatever else it may be. None of these police officers get prosecuted and imprisoned for killing black people. Even and particularly, of all the deaths in custody, the highest percentage are of black males suffering mental distress. So the police are called. Somebody is clearly off the heads. You taser them 4 and 5 times. And as in the case of this one in wherever it was in South London, you stand with your foot on their neck. Another George Floyd. So all of this reaction to George Floyd in 2020 on the part of people here in Britain, you would have thought that we didn't have, we've never had our own George Floyds. But we've been having our George Floyds for decades. And so it is very important that, okay, the media in this country is, all right, let me save the expletives. The media in this country does not serve the cause of justice. Let's put it as elegantly as that, right? And to a large extent, the media reinforces and helps to sustain the systemic racism that we suffer in the society. And if you want a recent example of that, just look at how they reacted in relation to Harry and Meghan. Total manipulation. It's corrupt, it's nasty, it's ugly, it's racist. I'll come back to you in a minute. Let me just share this. You will have seen, and I promise you, that's the last thing I'm going to say about this matter. You will have seen last week, Saturday, a number of baronesses and dames and God knows what else, parading themselves, this one carrying the orb, Fluella Benjamin carrying the scepter, walking up the aisle looking like royalty herself, and proud of it. So all of these black people are handpicked by the palace to demonstrate. They knew that everybody from around the world would be watching that ceremony, okay? So they determined to orchestrate the optics of diversity. Floella Benjamin, Elizabeth Anyonwu, Valerie Amos, this one, that one, all with major roles. When Elizabeth was crowned, and before that, those roles that these black people played on Saturday were reserved for the same people who had the boots on the necks of our ancestors. They're the ones who were valorized and chosen by the state to do those things. So this time, they wheel out all of these people. So you had Floella Benjamin up front with the Archbishop of Canterbury, holding the scepter so that it could be handed to Charles. Meanwhile, way back there is Harry, Charles's son, with his cousins bringing up the rear. Halfway up the aisle behind those other royals is none other than Andrew, the pedophile, in full regalia. My boy, Harry, is in his morning suit. Okay, he had his tails, but I mean, morning suit nevertheless. Andrew is in full regalia. So his pedophilia, which cost the Queen or whoever 12 million pounds, is seen as a minor infraction as compared to Harry calling out that damned monarchy on the racism against his wife. Now, I do not believe that Floella Benjamin gave a toss about any of that. But what we cannot allow such people to do is to claim to be representing us, all of us as black people, and giving the impression to the world, everybody looking from China, India, the Philippines, wherever, that Britain is so advanced. Even when it's crowning its new king, you've got these blacks in the business. That's the danger we're in. And our independent organization has got to be in relation to empowering ourselves to understand the state, understand its manipulative practices and potential, and be prepared to call one another out. Call one another to account. And when, you know, I was really encouraged today by you guys, right? These stars in the front here. Fantastic people. We had a wonderful session. And okay, you know, I'm an old fogey. I shall continue to kick ass till there's no longer any breath in me. But I'm 78 years old, for Christ's sake. Okay? And I'm encouraged by you, because in you I see hope for the future. People talk about succession planning and blah, 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 blah. Who are you going to hand over the baton to? But you guys have already got hold of the baton. And the slower the likes of me are physically able to run, is the quicker you're going to take that baton and run with it. So I'm deeply encouraged by yourselves. You are the leaders of the future. And be prepared to kick some ass. And tell the Floella Benjamins and that lot that they don't represent you. You represent the future of this society, and you're going to build it on foundations that have got to do with justice, with equity, non-discrimination, and non-repetition of the kind of stuff that Britain did in the days of colonialism and empire. What was your question?
Stemming off of what we were just talking about as well, I think definitely there is an issue when it comes to like empowerment and self-confidence amongst our generation, I'd like to say, because I think when you're raised in an environment where the media is so like compelling as to what we believe, like last week they're parading stolen jewels from like places that we like to align our culture with. It's like when you're brought up in a oh, this is turned off.
The other one should be working.
Oh, okay. Hello. No. Is this
This one.
okay? Back on.
Yeah.
Wait, you want me? Okay.
Play that.
Okay, yeah. So when you're kind of brought up in a society where the suffering of people of colour is so normalised, it kind of indoctrinates you to think that your struggles aren't necessarily worthy of the way they have been brought up in the past, I guess. Because I think the UK, compared to places like America, like to believe that we're so advanced socially. Like, there's a big absence on the way that racism operates in the UK because it's more covert than overt. Like, you could even argue that's not the case, but the perception of it is that.
Like the George Floyd thing, like I think like what you were saying earlier about like how many George Floyds we've had in our own society, and the fact that I think as well, especially in like the UK, how the media demonizes certain aspects of like our cultures and like knife crimes and like, you know, being careful about all those things when in reality those aren't the issues that like I guess like the taxpayer faces, you know, and they're talking about how like all of our money is going to the NHS as like taxpayers, and you know in reality, you know, like the taxpayer money is taken to cover for the fact of all the, you know, the fraud and the tax fraud that is committed by the big companies which are owned by white people. Yeah. And instead we're demonized as, you know, people of colour for for like creating like these communities and gang violence, and kind of like how that is demonized as the main kind of societal issues that we face, instead of looking at kind of like the system and how our education system labels young black youth. You know, we have a curriculum that nobody of colour can relate to. You know, there's nothing for us in the education system. We're labelled badly, and they expect us to come out of the other end and do well.
Yeah. And I also think that, I think it's also a thing of then when your experiences are invalidated for you by someone else, you're kind of reluctant to get onto the scene like where we are right now, because we're 18, and for me personally, I feel like it's been like, I wish I could have done this earlier and really like got stuck in and realised what's wrong earlier. But I think the absence of, I guess, any racial awareness or any like
role models in the community. I think especially coming from Oxford Spires Academy, you know, our staff body is not representative of our student community, and I think it's hard to speak to people who you know don't relate to your struggles.
Sure.
And then it's like, once you have the freedom as you're older to talk to people who you might align your struggles with, then you just feel like it's not necessarily, you haven't had the time to really build this like movement and this like collective consciousness that you think everyone else should have, because there hasn't been an opportunity previously. And it feels a little bittersweet that we've come to this like a bit too late to understand like what we can do when we only have so many months left of school. So.
I mean, thank you for those observations. They're very important. Let me just say this. I think it was Dan earlier who mentioned intergenerational conversations, right? Those are very important, not just between seasoned veteran activists like myself and people like you, but between you and your parents and your grandparents in your own homes. Because this country has a pretty nasty way of discarding people. Once you've got to your pension age and you've contributed to the economy, etc., you consider it to be redundant. And that is why this country has got perhaps the worst record in terms of elderly social care. It's, you abandon people, basically, which is not part of our culture, all right? So what does that mean? It means that we need to ensure we create environments and habits, not environments, habits, in which children speak to parents, parents listen to children, in which talk is not a rarity in the home. So parents are watching whatever it is on, I don't know, Netflix or whatever, and the children are stuck with these gizmos. And a new one comes along every so often. Instagram and TikTok and Christ knows what else. Shutting down conversation, effectively. So we have to find ways of ensuring that those gadgets do not blot out conversation altogether, and that the only thing you are hearing is not what you're exchanging with your friends on Instagram. Critically important. So intergenerational conversations which acknowledge that the elders amongst us have got a huge repository of knowledge that can be shared. They subscribe and have subscribed to certain values which they seek to hand on to people of your generation. They have experiences. I keep saying to people that people like me, and particularly my parents who were much older, when I came to this city in August of 1964, I was only 19 years old. My parents, when they came here, were older. And they had had a life experience with Britain in the Caribbean before coming here. With all the colonial education and so on and so forth, but an experience of struggle. Because you couldn't be alive in pre-1945 Caribbean and not being part of struggle. Every day was a struggle for survival, for bread, for justice, for freedom. There were workers' riots, there were uprisings all over the place. We had to challenge the plantation system because although slavery was abolished, God knows how many years before, the system and structure of engaging with people and their employment and the use of the labor was still very much similar to what was happening immediately after slavery. So that when Arthur Lewis wrote his book in 1938, Labor in the West Indies, what he's describing in that book the most appalling conditions that people were living under 10 years before this boat they keep crowing about, the Windrush, came to this country. Only 10 years. And if you read that book, it brings water to your eyes to think that this was people's reality. How they worked, how little they were paid, issues around shelter and so on. Okay? So the generation of your parents and grandparents have a lot to share and a lot to learn. A lot to learn from yourselves. So we've got to break down these hierarchies and some of these peculiar habits, etc., that we have, and put a premium on positive talk and conversation and learning. The one thing I think we've established already in this conversation today is that it is crazy, lunatic, to leave the education of our children to schools. That's why we started the supplementary education movement, in my case here, in 1965. We cannot, I mean, you who will be young parents, we cannot hand over our children to that system and expect them to come out right at the other end. Therefore, independent organization, looking at curriculum, looking at the dynamics of learning, how best we learn, how we learn and share, how what we learn relates to the realities of our existence, climate justice, climate change, the continuing exploitation and underdevelopment of Africa, the change from British colonialism and imperialism to Chinese colonialism and imperialism. And by understanding how the society functions and how useless the systems we now have are, especially that two-party system, and quite often there isn't a choice. I mean, what choice there is, for Christ's sake, between Sunak and Starmer? I mean, somebody tell me, please. What choice is there? Both right-wing, unjust. Let me stop. So the point I'm making is this. We have it within ourselves, within our own homes, within our communities, to harness our power to make a difference and bring about change. And we have to attend to that more and more and more. We need to ensure that we organize across ethnic and class divides. People of African heritage, people of Asian heritage, white people. When, I can't remember how many years ago, Professor Biku Parekh was chairing a commission on the future of multi-ethnic Britain. I gave verbal and written evidence to that some years ago. And one of the things I said there was this, that the future of Britain is in the hands of the children of former enslaved Africans and Asians, indentured Asian labor. It's in the hands of the children, grandchildren of slave owners, and everything in between. So what we've got to do is to ensure that these elite systems that there are around the place, including Oxford University, that place has got one function, for God's sake. and its function is to recycle elitism. It's got no other purpose, right? Recycle elitism. And those who get validated and whatever by it are considered to have the capacity, the knowledge, etc., to go and inform knowledge production and so on around the place. And that becomes a system of elitism in itself. We have to lay claim to our right to quality education, to how that education is organized. If I am required by law to send my children to school, I don't want my children to go to school and encounter any damn police. So don't tell me that you as government are going to have police in schools. You go into one of these academies and you find a mini police station as soon as you enter the damn place. What is that about? I do not send my children to school to be criminalized. And we collectively have got to make sure that we boot the police out of schools. Collectively. We don't have to wait for another child queue for it to happen. And we have the capacity and the power to do that. We can't sit back and allow these things to happen by default, because they're injuring us and our children. No school should have some mini police station. There was a time, and look, I used to be a director of education, all right? There was a time when schools would have pastoral heads, a head teacher without teaching responsibilities dealing with pastoral issues. Why was that important? It was important because children are in a process of development. Primary children, particularly secondary children, dealing with all the challenges of adolescence, etc., etc., etc. Yeah? And in that period, biologically, we are programmed to hit against boundaries, to be as reckless as we could be allowed to be, and all of that kind of stuff. And therefore, in the process of growing up and interacting with our peers, etc., we need to learn what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And when we do inappropriate things, we don't expect some head teacher to call the police from down the corridor and say, come and deal with this. I've got a godson who was charged by the police at one stage. Why? Because he and some other friends were on a corridor, some on this side, some on that side. And as one particular year group was coming by, they were tripping them up. One boy fell, broke his front tooth and so on. So the head teacher calls the police. Because as far as he was concerned, dangerous, causing bodily harm, and so on. Now, how stupid can you get? And this notion that everything should be punished, and particularly black young people should be criminalized, is something we've got to kick back against. So I'm coming back to what I was saying before. Independent parents' power, independent students' power. You guys ought to be able to meet independently of teachers. Have your discussions. Talk about the way you experience schooling. Talk about what's wrong with the quality of teaching you get. What's wrong with curriculum and all of that stuff. And not be constrained or punished or inhibited by the school in doing so. It is your right. So if teachers could go and have their NUT or whatever it's called these days, meetings, then you as students have a right to sit and talk about your learning experience. If you were not there, none of those people would have jobs. They'd probably be planting cabbages or something stupid. But they won't have jobs teaching you. So you are an important part of that whole equation. You're not unionized, but collectively you can have a voice. And if there's one thing I want to see before I pop my clogs, is the growth of a strong, powerful school students movement in this country. It could not be more necessary. And people like the ones you're talking about must see themselves as being accountable to you. You have a right to be on interviewing panels if they're going to appoint a new head teacher to your school. What kind of person are you? What is your experience? What do you know about working in inner city areas? What experience have you got of working with black children? Across the piece, not just in education. In spite of all of these years of our struggling with racism in this country, routinely, day after day, these total nincompoops get appointed to senior positions within those places. No cultural competence, no competence to deal with race as a form of oppression, and yet we were expected to hand over people like you to them. And all Ofsted is concerned about is the extent to which they managed to get 10 and 13 GCSEs out of you. It's iniquitous. But collectively, we've got to do something about it, my friends. And we can.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
I'm going to hand over again in a second to Nigel to open up to you guys, to open up the discussion. Just want to make 2 quick announcements. There are some costs associated with this event, the hire of the hall. We want to obviously cover Gus's travel and so on. If you can, if you're able to, I'm going to send this round. If you're able to put in a $5, that would be amazing. If you can't, don't worry. If you can afford more, even better. So I'm going to start sending this round over here. Just put in whatever you can. If you haven't got any cash, just stick your bank card in the box. We can take that. That's fine. And the second thing, on your chair, you've got 2 leaflets. One is a leaflet for you to take home about the Malcolm X movement. The Q&A and discussion.
Okay, I'm sure after that really wonderful discussion from Professor Gus John and with Khadisha and Anisha, you've got lots of questions. I have myself, but I will be patient and wait for you guys to put some questions forward. So, who would like to put a question to Professor Gus and Khadisha and Anisha as well? And I think we'll take the questions in clusters. So we'll take a group of questions and then over to our the panel here, and then another group of questions. So I think I saw Roz with a question. So go ahead, Roz.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gus, first of all. I'm thinking about, well, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we challenge the indifference of those with power and the kind of the collusion of the political class with the media and the narrative that is kind of given to the masses. You spoke about organising and creating groups. Once those groups are formed, how do we hold those power structures to account publicly without with the direct opposition of mass media?
Okay, thanks, Rose. Another question, maybe if we can keep the questions quite tight, because there's a lot of us, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people have got a lot of questions. And so, yeah, so if we keep the questions concise as possible. So, next question.
Too concise.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Amazing discussion. Like, yeah, completely echo that. And I was just curious what your guys' opinion was on how gender intersects with the issue of race and class when it comes to decolonising the curriculum and reformulating education.
Just one more question. Got another question?
Thank you for a wonderful session. You talked a bit about gang violence, and I think it's very apparent that it's a symptom of a deeper problem. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the unwillingness to tackle the root causes of the problem, and instead, you know, put more of the focus and more of the efforts towards, you know, harsher policing.
Sure.
You know,
Yes.
how do you see a way forward from that?
Okay.
Okay, so let's answer those 3 questions and then, yeah? So
3 really very important questions. Let me try and be brief with my answers because I know you don't want to be here till midnight. First of all, I think we need to think in terms of organizing differently, and doing bite-sized things. One of the problems with the kind of issue we're talking about, it's very easy for us to go away from this room and say, "Oh my God, this is so huge. This is so, you know, monumental. What can little old me do to make a change?" I've already said what we need to do at a unit of home and parental organization level. One of the things that I have always wondered about is this. Over a period of years, practically every employment situation where there are more than 5 people running around, you have a black staff network or a black members group or whatever else it may be. They appear everywhere, in the health service, the National Police, Black Police Association, the Crown Prosecution Service, all over the place. Every single one of them acts independently. So imagine if you had all of those people from around the country coming together. Okay, you can organize regionally. This group in Greater Manchester works locally and regionally. And then those regions come together nationally. And you're addressing issues to do with the government's immigration policies, you're addressing issues to do with education, you're addressing issues to do with policing, you're addressing issues to do with the care of the elderly, whatever it may be. And these are focused, because the one thing that distinguishes us as black and global majority people from, for example, our colleagues in the trade union movement who are white, is that our work is never done. We might organize ourselves in the workplace in relation to pay and conditions, etc., like everybody else. But then we leave them, we go home, and we've got to be concerned about police stop and search of our children. We've got to be concerned about our children being in fear of one another and walking around with knives. We've got to be concerned about issues around childcare and so on and so forth. So that means, therefore, that we need to have independent forms of organization that enable us to make adequate and meaningful interventions in relation to those issues. And it's not enough, for God's sake. It's not enough to say, well, we have a ward councillor here, and we go and see ward councillor X in his surgery on Saturday morning or whatever it is, and have our problems dealt with. It's it disempowers people, okay? It makes you dependent upon the capacity of that one person to influence what the chief executive is doing in a town hall or what individual cabinet members are doing. And you remain totally powerless. Who on earth wants to put themselves in the hands of Keir Starmer, for God's sake? Why? So we have to empower ourselves. And when we do that, and we have our conversations, and we deal with the issues that constitute the conditions of our existence, then we know we are setting the agenda. So we're able to say to these councillors, you deal with this or get out of the way. And the same in terms of MPs, etc. That system is broken. It is totally broken. And people think, well, it's democracy, and you know, what do you want? Do you want to have Putin or whatever as it may be? It doesn't have to be democracy or Putin. And the whole system has been about disempowering the working class. Because people who are rich and have got power and so on and so forth, they don't have to worry about those things too much. That's the first thing. The second point I want to make is this, that when we consider how we organize ourselves in relation to the things that we require to do day by day, we need to have some belief that there is already amongst us good examples of organization. There's already amongst us good examples of men acting independently, men acting in support of women, women acting independently. And there are endless examples of that if you look at the way society has organized itself. I was saying earlier to Zara and others down at OSA, you know, that we have to understand how some of the advances that we've made came about. There were struggles before we could have the 1968 Race Relations Act. I was a member of the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, CARD, in the middle 1960s. Women campaigned like crazy, not just the women's movement, the feminist movement, for the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975. People with disabilities had to do all kinds of stuff, including tying themselves to railings outside Parliament, to get the 1995 Disability Discrimination Act. All of those things came about not because of the largesse of people in Parliament, but the struggles of people who have been historically dispossessed, disadvantaged, marginalized. And we have to understand that, go back to the roots of it, and pattern our own systems of organization based upon that.
I think we've got perhaps just a little bit more time for just another round of very short questions, 3 more short questions. If not, I'll hand over to Dan and we'll maybe think about having some food. But, you know, okay, there's a hand going up there. So, Sukan? Sorry, brother. Sorry.
Alright, I'll try and be quick. I wrote a plan for this question, which is a sign of a great talk. It's not necessarily a sign of a concise question, so I'll try and work on shortening. I thought that one of the themes that came up a lot in the discussion was one of atomization. Within black communities, when things go wrong, as you pointed out, the blame is shifted to individual young people, individual families. When things, what we might call, go right, we have this hollow politics of representation, what you call the optics of diversity, right? So this hollowed out thing, right? Replacing community struggle, community movements, and so on. And into this context, there's the disappearance, maybe not total, in fact certainly not total, but of, for example, black supplementary schools
Yes.
and that movement. So I'm curious what your analysis is, I suppose, of why that momentum was perhaps lost, or whether it was shifted elsewhere and is less visible, and what lessons maybe we can learn from that, as there is this renewed momentum. We can see that with the, all of you up on stage, I suppose. What lessons can we learn from maybe what didn't go right in the past?
Okay. You wanted to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, with our young people, what would your advice be to them to kind of stand up and be counted? Because I'm fortunate enough to work with these lovely young people, but when they do speak out, they're often shut down, and I see it firsthand, and I encourage them to speak up, but it's very difficult in an organisation where it is predominantly white. And you know, I do have lots of conversations with those two up there about the struggles, and I encourage them to speak up, but then it's turned around on them that they're defiant, and they're you know, that can't be the narrative for them. They need to, you know, how what would your advice be to them?
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll take that last one first. I think you raise a very important point. And when I talked about independent students' power earlier, that is what I was actually alluding to. The model that many of these schools, particularly academies, are using just now is that those people are on some kind of a conveyor belt. And at the end of the conveyor belt, there must be a product. That product is X number of degrees at this grade, and so on and so forth. And so Ofsted says you're good, you're outstanding, you need an injection, whatever else it may be. All right? My point is that students themselves have got to break that particular mold. Every child wants to be successful. Every child wants to be able to pursue a career and go through school in a way that enables them to achieve that. But that can't be at the expense of their development. That's my point. Which is why I was saying, you know, students are in a constant process of development. They must be able to question, raise questions, hold people to account, hold one another to account, and learn the skills that they would require in adult life. If they're not enabled to learn that in all of these years from 4, 5 till 18, there's a complete waste of time. Waste of time, waste of money, waste of talent, waste of opportunity, waste of a future. So, what am I saying? When I talk about independent parents' power and independent students' power, I mean that parents should organize independently as parents. Students have the right to organize independently, but then both have got to work together. If you had an organized group of parents, for example, at OSA or whatever it is, and those parents are clear about their purpose, part of that purpose being supporting their children in their organization, then nobody, whether it be the head of the mat or the head teacher or the director of it, the Secretary of State for Education, could come there and tell them anything. But we leave our children exposed to that kind of oppressive regime if we do not put support systems around them. And one of those support systems is parents organizing themselves to hold those same schools to account. That is what we try to do in relation to the exclusions work I do with that charity of which I'm a chair every single day and every single week. And I can't stress that too much because the system doesn't like the idea of these people having a voice. But the student voice is critical to the success of any school. So they must be able to demonstrate that degree of intelligence, capacity to organize, reflective capacities, analytical capacities, and organize themselves not only to demand change on the part of the institution, but change in terms of the way they themselves organize to achieve their goals. It's a reflexive system, and we have seen situations when in Pimlico in London, a group of students decided to take action and not attend classes, organize rallies and demonstrations in the school. The head of that academy got the academy trust to write to everybody saying, parents saying, if you don't control your children, then they'll be out on their necks and so on. But that should not be allowed to happen. The parents have a right to go and sit with their children in that place and say, you either give in to those demands or you don't continue in here. Our children would stay. We would take over the school and find our teachers. These things need radical interventions. We can't bring about change within that sorry, useless, oppressive consensus. And we have to get that into our heads. That's why I salute the people who are striking. Nurses and doctors and rail people and so on and so forth. I mean, I might not be able to get home tonight, but I support the train strikers. Yeah? That becomes critical. And what I'm saying is, we need to see examples of that. I talked about small bites. If that happens at OSA, if it happens at Oxford Academy and or all the other places around about, and people know that it is happening, and they know they can share strategies. This is what we did, it was successful. These are things that we did, and we came upon these barriers. And they're exchanging that information. People do it all the time. They meet in boardrooms, they meet at expensive conferences, and they share stuff about how they could screw us to the wall, whether in terms of prices or this or that or the next thing. Don't believe that these people who run the system stay in the little cubby holes and do nothing. They're constantly networking and planning and so on. We are the only ones who stay in our place and take whatever stuff, whatever manure they pour on our heads. Very quickly, coming to your happening in the society. Sokant and I were having exactly that conversation just before we came to this building. To a certain extent, we have not been sufficiently organized collectively in relation to the real threats that we face. There's been too much atomization going on, and that gets institutionalized. Okay. The period that I'm talking about, when I was here in Oxford, I was working as closely with Punjabis in Jericho as I was working with people from the Caribbean in Cowley and Blackbird Leys. Okay. Nobody in that period used stupid phrases like black and brown. And we certainly didn't use notions of BAME, right? we saw ourselves as being under threat from a common enemy, British racism, orchestrated by the state systemically. And therefore, we needed to, while it may have impacted upon us in different ways because of our different histories, we needed to find common approaches to dealing with the common enemy. So, as I was saying to Dan and Sakant earlier, we worked with the Indian Workers Association. We worked with the Pakistani Welfare Association. We were as present at the Imperial Typewriters dispute in Leicester, which involved mainly Asian workers, and at Grunwick as we were in relation to any other dispute. We supported the miners' strike and Arthur Scargill and the NUM and so on. We've got to return to that. So this notion that, you know, we have Africans here and Asians there and what have you is a complete nonsense. And that's what I meant when I said we've got to organize across ethnic and class divides. Because without that, we really are on a hiding to nothing. There's a difference between my generation and these young people, okay? My parents' generation and we ourselves had a focus necessarily on issues to do with national independence, issues to do with ending colonialism, issues to do with combating racism in Britain. We were constantly sending remittances back to wherever it is so that people wouldn't starve, because Britain left them denuded of wealth and opportunity and so on. Their generation have got other issues to contend with. They don't belong to the Grenada Overseas Association anymore, or the Trinidad and Tobago Society, etc. They are young, bright, aspiring British people who want the opportunity to make their mark on that place and fashion it in a manner that does not require them to be constantly struggling against bloody racism, for Christ's sake. Yeah? So therefore, for them, for their children who are descendants of people of Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian heritage, people from the African continent itself, people from Hong Kong and India, and white people. There's one particular man called Matthew somebody or other, I can't remember his name, professor, sociologist, who peddles this nonsense about white working class children are being neglected. Matthew Godwin, that's it. White working class children are being neglected, and all the attention is being paid to black kids. Okay, it's nonsensical on a number of levels. First thing, you don't treat people equally by treating them all the same. So if black children historically are constantly bumping along the bottom of the barrel, you've got to do something about that. And doing something about that does not mean you displace opportunities to do something about the needs and aspirations of the white working class. So that idiot is talking through the hole in his head when he comes out with that nonsense. But at the same time, we've got to understand there would be these challenges. There are internal dynamics within any particular group. Within and across groups, there are those dynamics. We've got to work through them. But be very clear and have a vision about the future we want to build and how we do that. And frankly, we won't do it if our progress depends purely on being able to put across near somebody's name, corrupt or otherwise, 4 times a year, 4 times, every 4 years. I wish it were 4 times a year. Every 4 years. We have to cease that dependency upon the Labour Party and the Conservatives, etc. They might as well get married tomorrow and become one.